Just waiting for everyone to join. It's almost 7:30. Okay, well, we'll start off now. Good evening, everybody. My name's Carl. I'm a trustee at BIBA. Welcome to the 17th webinar organised by BIBA this year. Almost all actually pretty much arranged by Roger. He's done a very much a good proportion of the presentations as well. I did think that, oh great, there's only 2 more to go to the end of this series, but Roger did send through a list yesterday with another 25 webinars he wants to have us do coming up from this. If you're interested, by all means, have a look on the biba.com website and webinars on there, or there's another website called beekeeping.events, and there'll be a list of webinars on there, which are bigger ones, but also other ones that are being hosted around the country. Loads of them are free, so by all means have a peek and a look. Tonight's speaker again, Roger. Roger with the brightest yellow braces I've ever seen. I'm really tempted to say, are they a birthday present? But I'll try not to mention it's your birthday today because you told me not to. Anyway, tonight's talk is some fresh ideas on teaching and learning. Over to you, Roger.
Good evening, Carl. Good evening, fellow beekeepers, and welcome to the not quite the penultimate webinar, but certainly of mine. There are. Yeah, it's quite amusing, really. Carl did mention that perhaps it might have been my birthday today. In fact, I didn't realise it was until I had a phone call about 10:30 from my friend Jackie, who's out on the Lochar Peninsula in South Wales. In a howling gale, phoned me up, wished me a happy birthday. So that's I forgot all about it. Anyway, that's more than enough of me. Let's get on to the beekeeping. So some fresh ideas for teaching and learning. When I say fresh, they're probably not fresh to me or the older beekeepers, but some of what I'm going to say is probably new to, or fairly new to, some of you newer beekeepers. But before then, just the usual opening up. You know about the book by now. I really must keep mentioning Dave Cushman's website because I keep coming across beekeepers who've never even heard of it. Now, that may well be a sort of failure of local beekeeping associations for not letting their members know. But anyway, if you want good sound information, it's on there. So now into the presentation proper. From the last webinar, which I called Where We Are, How We Got Here and How We Can Move On. Where we are, I described various bees and locations and said that they did actually differ greatly. I mentioned importation, the reasons that people give for importing bees, a bit of the history and some of the problems that is considered can be caused. So how we got here, I spoke a bit about the evolution of honeybees as we know it, the various subspecies that are relevant to us in our part of the world, the hybridization and mongrelization that causes, and some of my experiences. And then in How We Can Move On, I asked why perhaps we might want to improve bees and can we actually do it? So to come today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall knowledge and skills level in beekeeping, some of the changes, what beekeepers are taught to perhaps improve the bees we've already got, how we might do it, and a bit about teaching and learning. But before then, I thought it might be appropriate to give you a little bit of an insight as to my beekeeping experience is. I started in 1963, June 1963. I've handled and managed more colonies than most beekeepers do. Obviously not the same as out and out commercial beekeepers or perhaps bee inspectors. I'm a practical and observant person, and that's how I treat my beekeeping as well. And the bees have actually taught me an awful lot. That's where a lot of my knowledge has come from. I've been in the privileged position of traveling widely. Therefore, I've seen lots of different bees owned by different beekeepers in different localities. And that has given me a very open mind about my views on beekeeping, because what suits one doesn't always suit another. And the sort of narrow vision that some beekeepers have got, I think, is a pity. Nothing wrong in that, because that's probably just a reflection on their own particular area. I've been teaching and demonstrating for well over 40 years, and for more than 15 years now, I've been apiary manager of my local association, Whisper Green Beekeepers Association in West Sussex. I think I'm reasonably experienced. There may well be some who disagree with that, but let's not worry about people who are disagreeing. So really, folks, whatever your level of knowledge and experience, I'm actually on your side, and I'm on the side of your bees too, because I tell what I know, not what other people know, or sadly, we're getting more and more recycling from elsewhere. So teaching and learning, and I think they really do go together pretty obviously, but they really have got to be in a form, the teaching's got to be in a form that the learning will be interested in and of course absorb. Some of the things I say today may appear to be quite hard hitting. I had a few several emails about last week's webinar, and a couple of them mentioned that I said things that a lot of people are thinking, but not many people are bold enough to talk about. So I'm probably a little bit forthright. However, if I say something, I don't intend to be critical or dismissive of it, because different people have different ways of doing things, and it's what suits them that's really important, providing the bees are cared for in a good manner. So I hope there's no offence taken. Any identification will be unintended. So please don't switch off if you think I'm pointing fingers at you, because I'm more than likely to mention something that I've seen several times, not just once, which may or may not happen to be you. There's lots of been changes in life and beekeeping in my time, some massive, massive changes. And in my view, we ought to accept them and try to work with them, not just witter on about the good old days and what things used to be like. Yeah, they probably were different than they are now, and we probably had different recollections of them. But things move on, and we've somehow got to try and work with it. We are all in this together for the simple reason that all of us, if we've got bees, we've got, okay, the queens, her progeny are, they can be limited. But of course, the drones are out there mating with everything else that's available to mate with. So your bees will probably be reflected one way or another in the locality. I'm hoping to try and improve standards. That's what I'm striving for all the time, with both bees and beekeeping. Personally, I think our bees deserve it. They've had a dreadful kicking from humanity, and I think we ought to do a little bit of repayment. So here's a bold statement, and anybody who knows me will know that I'm not normally dishing bold statements out, but here goes. In my view, the overall knowledge and skill levels have actually declined in my time in beekeeping. But don't be too concerned, because I can tell you we aren't alone. In 2016, 2017, I was invited to go to the Hudson Valley, which is in New York State, to do some teaching out there on bee improvement. And I found out there almost exactly the same as I find here. But they probably a little bit worse, because what a lot of people in the north tend to do is to start their beekeeping or buy bees as package bees from the southern states. And up in the Hudson Valley, they can get 10 feet of snow during the winter. Of course, down in California or Florida or Texas or somewhere like that, there's very, very little. So, of course, the bees are very, very different. They bring them up, put them in a hive, and of course they roar away because they feed them because they're told to, and of course they just fall over during the winter. And I have to say I was a little disappointed in the knowledge of some of the beekeepers with 20, 30 colonies. Not all of them. Some of them were actually quite good, but there were some that were they needed to learn a bit more. That's what I really mean. I tend to get a lot of emails. Fairly recently, I've had one from a Tennessee State bee inspector, an email, and I'll quote from it. I'm in search of knowledge of beekeepers like you that observe the bees. As a local area state inspector, 30 years into having bees, I find people do not know what's going on in their hives. I'm amazed they know so little. Well, the key areas are this one here, observe the bees. I did say that I was an observant chap, but I do see a lot of beekeepers. They're looking at their hives, but they're not actually observing things. A lot of people sort of tend to gawk with mouth open and, oh dear, isn't this wonderful, that sort of thing, without actually looking to see what the individual bees are doing. I'll leave that one there. People do not know what's going on in their hives. I regularly come across people who've been keeping bees 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years who don't even know the life cycle of anything. And I'm being serious. A couple of years ago, I came across somebody who'd been keeping bees 20 years, came to one of our courses and didn't even know there are any notifiable diseases. So when I say the overall knowledge and skill levels have declined, okay, we always probably had those sort of people, but it's amazing that with modern methods of communication these days, that is still the case. So why is this? Well, I tend to look for reasons rather than excuses. And I think part of it is because beekeepers in general keep a lot less colonies now than they used to. I think the average in colonies per beekeeper in England and Wales is something just over 4, somewhere between 4 and 4.5. Whereas when I started keeping bees, a lot of beekeepers worked on the land in some way, and they probably kept between 15 and 50 colonies to augment their income, sold honey at the garden gate, that sort of thing. And people are in the craft a lot less now than they used to be. I think probably the average that somebody's in the craft these days is probably something about 6 or even 7 years at the most. Of course, it used to be a beekeeper would follow on from their parents or grandparents. So less time. Therefore, they don't have the time to build up the knowledge or the opportunity, really, to build up the knowledge or the skills. I think that's got an awful lot to do with it. Also, those of you who've been keeping bees 10 years or less won't understand this. 15 years or more as a beekeeper, and you might. Because about 15 years ago, over something like only about a 2-year period, there was a rapid influx of beekeepers, and they increased by about 3-fold. So what happened was the Beekeeping Associations saw these people coming and simply couldn't cope. And what a lot of them did, and you new beekeepers won't understand this, but what a lot of them did was either cap their membership or they suspended beginners courses. We didn't at Whisper Green because we felt that it was not the right thing to do, because we felt that beekeepers would probably start on their own. But there are some surrounding beekeepers, beekeeping associations that actually did that. And of course, the older beekeepers just put their hands up and said, sorry, I'm not dealing with this. So, of course, what happened is you ended up with beginners teaching beginners. And that, I think, is where the view with some associations is that this year's beginners teach next year's beginners. So, of course, what you end up with is the people doing the main teaching at the development stage really need a lot of teaching themselves. So you end up with a knock-on effect, which we're to a degree suffering from now. But of course, worse than that, a lot of the old knowledge and the old skills have completely gone. They've completely gone. You could call it supersedure if you wanted to. The result of this is there's now much learning from books and the screen. That, of course, brings forward a lot of misinformation, false logic, humanizing bees, poor advice, all those sort of things, and an awful lot of inappropriate information too, because with the internet, of course, you can pick things up from all over the world. And as I'm sure I've said on many occasions, what is performed in perhaps California or Georgia isn't necessarily suitable for cold, windy UK. That's developed into what I call standard teaching, a sort of beekeeping by numbers situation, where there are 50,000 bees in a hive. A queen lays 3,000 eggs a day. A worker bee lives 6 weeks. All that sort of stuff. And I'm beginning to detect, I think, quite as probably as partly as a result of that, some beekeepers or new beekeepers, perhaps going along to the local beekeeping association, not perhaps liking what they're seeing, or worse still, leaving because they're not getting the help that perhaps they need. And I've spoken over the last 5 years or so to quite a lot of beekeepers at places like the National Honey Show, BBK Spring Convention, who said that they no longer remember the local beekeeping association because the demonstrators know less than they do. So little or no guidance or ongoing tuition. So beekeeping associations then, I think if they're run really well, they've got a really good role to play because they're in the front line of teaching. Up until, so let's say up until about 40 years ago, a lot of counties had a beekeeping instructor, which they employed. And throughout the country, I suppose there were 40 or 50 of these people. And of course, the thing is with those people, they were interviewed with a job. If they weren't up to it, they didn't get the job. But of course, with beekeeping associations, it's sometimes really a case of whoever puts their hand up first. So, of course, they are very variable and they do rely on the personnel there at the time. You've got to remember that they're all amateurs, not paid like the county beekeeping instructors were. They're all volunteers, and some of them, certainly at Whisper Green anyway, some of them do a brilliant job, and they come along to meetings to teach others when perhaps they've rather got other things they would rather do. Of course, you also get the usual beekeeping politics of, people are probably promoted because they happen to be somebody else's friend or something of that nature. They got very variable resources too. Some have got absolutely no practical teaching. Others have got really good teaching apiaries with really good facilities. And it, as I say, it is very variable. But I think in general, most of them do the best they can with what they got. That's without much help, because of course, if you have any help, it's really got to come from the top. And that's really one of the things that Bibber are trying to concentrate on to help beekeepers keep their bees better. I put this in. I bet you wonder what it's all about. You can only teach people if people want to learn. Might sound a bit obvious, but what I'm noticing in the last perhaps 10 years or so, up until then, if somebody had a problem, you could explain it to them and they would understand it. So they could understand what's gone wrong in the colony, why the bees have done what they should do, and you'd be fairly certain it probably that the problem wouldn't happen again. But what I'm finding more and more, not so much with our members at Whisper Green, but when I go out doing teaching, people seem to just want the answer to a problem. They don't seem to want to know why the colony ended up in that state in the first place. And I don't know why. It might just be a knock on from the work situation. I really don't know. But I'm involved with beekeeping associations too, and I think we all need a bit of help, all of us, even me. So this webinar then is not to tell you what to do or how to do it. I hope I can give you a few ideas and perhaps suggestions that you might mull over. You might think, oh, that's a good idea, or that'll be okay if we modify it. Or if you want to chuck it in the ditch, chuck it in the ditch. I really don't mind, as long as you listen. Perhaps I can encourage a culture change, because I think that's what's needed. The standard teaching that I mentioned, I think we ought to question it. I encourage people to, and I've got a talk, and it's called what's it called? I'll forget it. It's a senior moment. That's because I've had a birthday. I'll get to it. But what we're told and taught really ought to be relevant to our conditions, not taken out of an American book or something like that. I think the theory is good up to a point. But whatever happens, however much you want to know about the theory, in my view, you really must learn the basics. The simple sort of stuff, the life cycles, what happens to a colony when it's swarming, the diseases, and that sort of thing. Yeah, I've got the name of this talk now. I'm sure some of you heard it. Challenge what you're told. Personally, I think practical tuition is very important, and I'll be concentrating a bit on that as well. Hopefully, I'll get people to look rather critically at what they do. I certainly do all the time, and I'm not frightened of change, because even after nearly 58 years of keeping bees, I still tweak things each year. And it's obviously getting a bit less, but certainly in the early stage, if you think you've made, well, not made a mistake, but you could have done something differently, give it a crack. Some modern teaching I'm finding is often done from an inexperience, which I've already mentioned. And this modern sort of way of teaching by rote, I'm not also very keen on, because what I found is that people are individuals, and you can have 4 or 5 people around a beehive, and people seem to learn in different ways. Some people you've got to literally explain everything to them. Others you just explain a bit, and they've got the rest. There's different ways of learning, but it concerns me a bit that some of the modern teaching is just pow, pow, pow. That's what you got. Sorry. Your course is over and that's it. A lot of which is classroom based. And some of the courses I hear about, there's very, very little practical. Now, to me, everybody's got to handle a colony of bees. Everybody's got to handle them. but they don't necessarily need to know how many segments are on a drone's antenna, for argument's sake. Much of what we're taught is appropriate to imported bees, which I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. I know some beekeeping associations, and quite a lot of them, just teach the first year only and then effectively abandon the others. And one lady I spoke to, she had gone through her first year's apiary training, and she had not handled a colony entirely on her own at all. What happened apparently, or so she told me, was that the demonstrator handled a colony and just took a frame out and handed to the half dozen people or whatever it is that was in the group. And at the end of the year, she hadn't got her bees yet. She asked what was happening next year, and they said, "Oh, well, nothing really." So she said, "Well, what about the second year?" "Oh, no, we don't do second year. If you want to know any more, go and read a book or have a look at some YouTubes." So, I mean, I'm sorry, but yes, perhaps I'm a little critical, but I don't know the situation there, or even what the lady told me was right. But she sounded very honest and frustrated too. But if that is happening, then perhaps the Beekeeping Association needs a little bit of advice. Some just simply concentrate on passing exams, teaching people to pass exam, get them through, and that's it. But the problem is the exams don't, in my view, teach people how to be good beekeepers from start to finish. And as I do keep hearing from beekeepers, qualifications don't actually make experts. So beekeepers then, in my experience, they tend to remember what they're first told. So I think you've got to get the good information into them straight away. Once they've learned something, good or bad, it's very, very often very difficult to get them to change. In my view, beginners are important and they deserve respect. They need a good start in their beekeeping life. Therefore, I believe they should be given the best teachers and demonstrators, and also good sound information, because you can learn far more from bees by getting your head stuck in a beehive than you can from all the books or the screen. In fact, the best teachers of beekeeping have got 6 legs and 4 wings. It concerns me that I think there's a view that beginners don't seem to have any sort of a value at all. Oh, they're only beginners. Oh, well, not many of them carry on. So we're wasting their time. Well, they're not going to if you don't put the effort in. We've got to accept that they are actually the future of the craft. Well, that's my view anyway. The beekeepers are often taught quite a lot too, that you must have large colonies to get a crop of honey. Therefore, you need prolific queen. You must have great big patches of brood. All your queens have got to be large queens. Requeen every 1 to 2 years. You need X amount of food for a colony to get through the winter. Single brood chamber, British standard brood is not big enough. And feed. And if you're in any doubt, feed again. But that may not be exactly what the bees want. I'm going to talk now a little bit about free living colonies. Over the years, I've called them wild and I've called them feral as well. But a couple of weeks ago, Grace McCormack told me off for calling them either of those. So I've got to call them free living. So from now on, if I call anything feral or wild, you've got to tell me off as well. So poor Grace don't feel too bad about it. Anyway, I've removed ever so many in my beekeeping life, several hundred from wild places, trees, buildings, and that sort of thing. And if they've been there any length of time, that is over at least one winter, there's a pattern to them. The queens are usually darkish, and they're usually quite small as well. and certainly not yellow. And you don't get these big yellow queens that everybody tells you should have. If you look at the drones, on the dorsal side, they're usually dark. Yes, the ventral side may be lighter, but there may well be a reason for that. And the workers, if there are any, if there's anything with yellow stripes or yellowish, some of the workers are probably going to be a bit sort of yellowish. That's just a sort of a throwback, I think. They're always non-prolific, and I've removed 200, 300, perhaps 400, always non-prolific. They're frugal and they're survivors. So guess what? They're very similar to our native bees. But looking at them, free living colonies are usually very, very much different than many of the managed colonies I see. Exotic types simply don't survive long in an unmanaged situation, whether it's a beehive or a tree or whatever. If you think about it, it's what two men by the name of Wallace and Darwin 180 years ago or whatever it was were telling us about natural selection. The bees have actually got it right. I don't think we should be fighting nature. So prolificacy, and I do get asked what I mean by a prolific queen. Well, it's really the egg laying rate of the queen. Obviously, the more she lays, the more prolific. Less she lays, the less prolific. But more bees doesn't often mean more honey. I know what some people would tell you. I'm making a statement. More bees doesn't often mean more honey, because in our rather fickle climate, we can very often get either a week or 2 weeks of bad weather where the bees don't fly, or perhaps even a nectar dearth. If you've got a prolific colony, you've got more adults and brood to feed. So if a colony is strong enough to fill a super in a week, which a strong colony will, it's also strong enough to eat it in a week as well. So here are my observations on prolificacy. Prolific ones will be Italians, Carniolans, and buckfasts. There are probably some others as well. But if you buy a queen, any of those sort, certainly during the summer, they are going to be prolific. Obviously, the queens lay more brood and need larger brood area, which means either larger hives, which means more weight, or multiple brood boxes, brood and a half, double brood chamber, or whatever. In that case, you've got more frames and sometimes of a different size as well. But of course, that also gives you more work per colony. And some people aren't very good at finding queens in 11 frames, let alone 22, whatever their size. One thing that concerns me is that they generally breed all the year round. I've certainly gone into colonies in December, and there's great big slabs of brood. I'm then thinking that perhaps Varroa will be at a higher level during the spring, but I don't know. They clearly need more food and all the other things that that are wrong with prolific bees. So food requirements for a large colony, they need very much more, not just liquid, but they certainly need pollen as well, because they've got all this brood to feed, don't forget. Beowulf Cooper, in his book, which I've got here, The Honeybees of the British Isles, he reckoned that Italian bees required about 2.5 times the amount of food for maintenance purposes than our native bees. I've never managed Italian bees throughout the year, but certainly my non-prolific bees that are what I call near native, I wouldn't disagree with that figure anyway. It's very difficult to do an experiment on it. What we've got to understand, and all beekeepers must understand, is that brood is incredibly hungry. Therefore, the more brood you've got, the more food that colony is going to require. And that's why when you get a poor weather, a lot of beekeepers are taking a feeding during the summer. The starvation when I started keeping bees was just a winter and perhaps a spring problem. Now it's a summer problem too, to the point where the National Bee Unit every summer give out warnings about starvation. It's not the native or local type bees that are the problem. It's usually the imports. Here's a hive here that was in an apiary where I did a demonstration, some distance from me. It was on the 15th of June one year, and I've got to be careful that I don't identify this, so I won't tell you which year. 15th of June. This colony, in fact, there were about half a dozen colonies, and they were all in the same state. They were all on double brood, absolutely wood to wood brood. So 20, let's say 20 frames, and the queen had laid a lot up. On top was an empty super, which originally I thought was a super, and at 15th of June, they probably extracted the oilseed rape or whatever and just put one of the supers back. That's what I thought. When I looked inside, there was a feeder inside there. Now, it was an arable area. There were very few trees and hedges. It was a rural area, so not many gardens as well. And it was surrounded by fields of carrots, corn and potatoes, none of which are really good for bee forage. So there was very little forage in the area. And what the bees were doing, because they were prolific, they were just turning food into brood that they really didn't need. But of course, what the feeder did was it encouraged the queen to lay even more. So, of course, they needed even more food. Now, I tried to explain to them, about 30 people there, I suppose. I tried to explain to them if they use non-prolific bees, they would probably be in a much better situation, and they might at the end of the day actually have some honey. But I was told very firmly that that's what everybody does around here. We change our queens every year, 2 years or whatever, and we get them from dear old whatever it is who imports them from here, there and everywhere. And they just got into this way of doing things, and they just would not even think about getting out of it, because that's what they always do. Here's summer starvation. One of our members at Woods for Green several years ago just would not wait for bees like everybody else. Had to get, I think he got 5 nukes online. Anyway, here was one of them. There's the outside frame there, and there are the dead bees down on the bottom. Now, there's the face of the frame that you've just seen. If you look at that area there, look at the brood in this outside frame, look, and look at the bees. But you see they're yellowish. If only he'd waited, he wouldn't have lost his bees. So, as a result of that, here's a few questions. Do prolific bees actually have to fly further for their food? If so, do they use more food in doing so? I think if the answer to the first one is yes, so is probably the second one. Does that then put more pressure on the local forage, not only for other honeybees, but also for other insects as well? Now, here's a hypothesis. I expect somebody else has come up with it before, but I haven't got round to hearing about it. Take an apiary, any size you like, doesn't really matter. Could be one colony, could be 15 or 20. If you've got non-prolific bees, then they presumably got a sort of range they would follow foraging. But if you change those bees to prolific bees, they would need more forage. Therefore, I think the radius will be bigger. It will be extended because they actually need more food. Although there may well be the same number of colonies, if you've got twice as many bees to feed and twice as much brood, you presumably need twice as much food. So are they forced to fly further because they've created a shortage? I'm only asking the question. Notice I've got question marks after this lot. What it also does is means that the bees 2 miles or 3 miles or whatever away have got the same problem. So there's going to be quite a bit of overlapping. Is it not worse with larger apiaries, such as perhaps commercial beekeepers dumping 15 or 20 colonies in one place? Not always on a permanent basis either. So they perhaps just coming in for the summer crop and then moving out. I don't know, and I certainly don't want to start blaming anybody. So does that then mean that more of the nectars out in the field is wastage, where the bees are really turning it into brood they don't really need, and perhaps using it up as fuel for a travelling cost to get it? I really don't know. I'm actually just guessing. Perhaps it's something, if it hasn't been done, needs investigating. Now, non-prolific bees of the type that I've decided that I want, the bees and queens are, worker bees that is, and queens are said to live longer. We can obviously measure queens quite easily, but it could well be quite a difficult job to see if the bees live longer. But my observation is that they probably do, and for the simple reason that for having colonies with fairly small brood nests, I still get strong colony of bees. So my guess is that perhaps the bees are adult bees are living a week, 2 weeks longer. If that is the case, it's taking the same amount of cost to the colony to get up to the emergent stage. So anything extra in the adult stage, providing the bee is being useful, has got to be a bonus. That's my line of thought anyway. You can keep on a single brood box all year round, therefore quicker inspections. There's usually food in brood box all year round, and they usually suit the climate. That's what I've always found anyway. So there's one of my colonies at the bottom of my garden. That looks pretty strong. And if you look carefully at the back, there's 4 supers there. So I've had 4 supers on that. I don't know how much honey there is in there. Probably, certainly 50, 60 pound, I would have thought. So my experience is that in a good summer, a prolific bees may do better. It's not quite as simple as that, but they may do. But in a poor summer, I've absolutely no doubt from what I've seen, the non-prolific bees do better, and the prolific ones may well want feeding. But if you take feeding into account, I mean winter feeding now, I think the non-prolific do better over a lengthy time, perhaps 10 or 15 years, something like that. And sometimes I'm hardly feeding my bees, yet other people are poking sort of 20 kilos into theirs. And the great thing about my bees certainly is they give a crop in a poor season. I say usually, but occasionally the odd colony doesn't for whatever reason. This is what I like to see. This is a middle comb out of one of our local colonies. In fact, yeah, looking at the background, yes, it is one of mine, I think. Look at those 2 lovely arches of food there. I like to see that because if you get a week's bad weather, that colony's going to survive. That one won't. Look at that. Now that's wood, what I call wood to wood brood. That queen was cold almost as soon as I saw that when I could replace her, because that colony, that queen probably, unless I fed it 3 lorry loads of sugar, just wouldn't have got through the winter. A single brew box, we keep hearing that, oh, single brew box not big enough. Well, I keep mine on single brood summer and winter. There's plenty of room for a non-prolific queen and plenty of room to get food in for, certainly to get the colony round to, there's food coming in naturally. I don't have any worse swarming issues than other people do. And this last year, it was for green teaching apiary, 20 colonies, full colonies, one attempted to swarm. I've got 23 at the bottom of my garden, or had at the time, and only one of those attempted to swarm. If you've got anything better than that, then let me know. Also, you can get a decent crop off them. 1, 2, 3, 5 supers there. If there's that much, there's probably £100 in that lot, I would have thought. But of course, I don't know. So a single national suits me. Why does it suit me? Because it suits the bees that I keep. If you've got very prolific bees, then very definitely you want perhaps a commercial brood chamber or a brood and a half or double brood or whatever. Now, this is the sort of stuff that we must teach, in my view, must teach beekeepers, must teach beginners, not, oh, don't have a British standard brood chamber, it's not big enough. It is if you've got the right bees. I think I showed last week 5 WBCs, all on single brood with 10% less brood area than the national, and they all gave £100 of honey. Now, if I got a second brood box, I don't want to put it above the top one. I want another floor and another roof, another crown board along the side, because two colonies in 2 brood boxes of decent bees will probably produce twice as much honey as one on a double brood chamber, and won't need, even with 2 colonies, won't need as much feeding. I hope I've given you a simple message here that large colonies with prolific queens, they do have a cost, and it is actually quite high. They are also unlikely to be best suited to our fickle climate. We as beekeepers have got to start listening to the bees, see what they do up in a tree and try and copy them. Urban beekeepers, there was a question last week about suburban beekeepers. So a similar sort of thing. I don't think I gave a very good answer, but I hope this explains it a little bit more. I'm finding, especially in London, a lot of the beekeepers are complaining about too many bees. Well, there may well be, but not too many colonies. Obviously, there's a high concentration of concrete and tarmac, which, if you think about it, is little different than carrots and potatoes and corn, which also doesn't provide nectar. So they've got similar situations that some of the rural beekeepers have got. I've got to ask a question: do prolific colonies waste food for the reasons that I've mentioned earlier? Are they perhaps creating their own shortage? And will prolific bees be more efficient, put more honey in the jars, and leave more for the bees for winter? Perhaps it will allow more colonies to be kept as well. So I'm being perhaps a bit bold here, but I'm saying there probably aren't too many colonies. But I'm wondering if they are too prolific, and perhaps there ought to be a little sort of test run if they use non-prolific bees, just see what the difference is. Queens, beekeepers are told they must be large, because small queens, they're scrub queens, they're no good. Larger queens have got more of areoles. I had a bit of fun with a speaker once when he mentioned this, and innocently, or apparently innocently, I asked a question to him what areoles were, and he couldn't tell me. So anyway, I asked who counted them. It's just the sort of stuff that comes straight out of books. Nobody knows really. Okay, there might have been some experiments done at some time, but you can't actually say that the small queens have got less, or even if it makes any difference. What a lot of books won't tell you, and teachers, speakers or whatever, they won't, or they don't tell you that queens actually change naturally in size, and it depends on the laying rate. if you have a look at a queen, let's say in the middle or end of May, when she's going like a train, look at her size, then have a look in the middle of August when she's not laying at all, and she'll be quite a bit smaller. So they do change quite a bit naturally. What I do know is I've had some very, very good small queens and some rather poor large ones. So size isn't really an issue. But if you think about it, the less prolific ones have got fewer eggs developing in their body, or I suppose they have. That's just a bit of conjecture on my part. I'm assuming they are. Therefore, my thinking is that they'll be smaller anyway. Queens must lay a lot of eggs. What on earth for if they don't need them? Why? What's really important, in my book it is that she's actually laying the required amount relative to the time of the year and the size of the colony. Queens from free living colonies are usually fairly small, which I think I've already mentioned. You don't get the big ones there. To requeen, must requeen every 1 to 2 years. I think this comes, or in modern terms, it comes from other countries, certainly commercial beekeepers, where they're probably moving the bees around, so they're foraging 12 months of the year, and the queens literally wear themselves out. So I heard this week that some commercial beekeepers, certainly in the States, are now requeening twice a year. But it's only a personal view. I think it's only prolific queens that actually need replacing simply because they wear themselves out. I've had some non-prolific queens that have been productive throughout their lives. And in the days when we could get queens to live 4, 5, 6 years, there was no dropping off at all. And there wasn't swarming like we're told there is. But of course, these days, queens are not lasting anywhere near as long as they used to. So it's not going to be make much difference. But in any case, if you've got a good queen, and to me, if she's lived certainly a year, if not 2 years, she's got to be a good queen. Why on earth get rid of her for something that that might be superseded straight away, or just disappear or fail? I don't see the logic. So I'm suggesting, folks, keep good queens as long as you possibly can. I only replace the poorer queens, not based on age. I'm quite happy to have an older queen. I happen to think that this is poor advice for our conditions. If you're shunting bees around and they've got 6, 8, 10 moves or whatever during a year, then yes, absolutely fine. But what I just told you is absolutely nothing new there, nothing new at all. It's what the older beekeepers knew, and so do bees. But of course, it's been lost through lack of continuity, which I've already discussed. Sadly, it's now seen as being wrong because of all the false logic. You know, you must have big colonies, all the rest of it, all the cut and paste from one place to another, the internet and all the worldwide information that comes through. Same old stuff gets seen in many places. So, of course, beekeepers, especially the newer ones, believe it. And they think it's the norm. It needs bringing back. Please, please, please. In Norman Carrick's talk, he discussed the Death for a Queen replacement survey of 2018. I'm going to do exactly the same, but for different reasons. There were 4,763 responses. Not everybody responded to each question. There were 26 questions. Quite frankly, I think some of them were very poorly put. It was difficult to understand them, or whatever. However, it did raise some quite good points. So I've selected some questions and I've rounded to percentages, which is something that Norman obviously had a problem with. So question 11, Why did you purchase queens instead of rearing them yourselves? So there were four possibilities, and the one that came out on top, I do not have the experience to raise my own queens. 41%. Now, if you think about it, virtually every beekeeper knows how to do swarm control, and in swarm control, you're producing new queens, therefore you're raising queens. So I think some of these figures are a little bit dubious. Question 15. What form of assistance would help you to increase the number of queens you rear in future? Training courses came out nearly 50%, 47%. Question 16. Would you be interested in attending a course that will help you improve your queen rearing skills? 60% said yes. I think they're all good points, although perhaps put in a way that I would prefer if it was done a different way. As beekeepers, or beekeeping in general, I think we need to address these, because what those three answers told me was that beekeepers actually want to learn. And there was a hint there that perhaps the teaching wasn't in place. But as I say, because the questions were so poorly put, I don't think you could necessarily read that into it. But I reckon we can all learn, even individuals. Somebody who's been keeping bees 57 years. We've all got space to learn for more, and the national and local beekeeping associations certainly have as well. So, folks, let's go for it, and you come with me. Because if we don't, I'm wondering if the bee population might not become further diluted, so perhaps less suitable to air conditions. Therefore, the general bee population will just be weaker and weaker and weaker, and less suited to the environment, perhaps ruin it forever. Personally, I think the losses are going to be higher and higher. Not all the losses are down to varroa or people doing daft things to the bees. Some of the losses I see are simply because the bees aren't tough enough. This isn't scaremongering, folks. It really isn't, because it's supported by long-term beekeepers, people who've been keeping bees for years and years and years, notice changing trends. It's certainly supported by the science, and Norman, I thought, did a pretty good job of giving us a selection of the scientific papers. And from my own experience, and I'm sure others as well, imported types certainly don't survive very long if they're unmanaged. So how can we do it then? Well, education, I'm afraid, teaching people in a varying ways. I'm coming back to teaching and learning, because they go together. You've got to teach good stuff, and then I think people will be interested and they will absorb it. We have got some resources. Beekeeping associations are obviously one. Others, such as MBU, there's a lot of BIBA stuff, and then I can tell you there's going to be more. But also you can learn an incredible amount yourself. That's what I've done it. If you're capable of interpreting what the bees are telling you, it's surprising how much you can learn. It won't happen overnight. It'll probably take a week or two longer, but it's something that we can set moving, and we will eventually get there. I think what we probably got to do is not just say, oh, what you're learning at the moment is rubbish. I think we've got to give an alternative, and if it's done in a sensible way, I think probably people can then make their own mind up. So with careful explanation and reasoning, I think we can do it. I never like force. Not a case of you do this, you do that, you do something else. If you persuade people what to do, take them with you, and they'll probably stay with you. How can we do it? Well, of course, by example and results. And that could be something like our good beekeepers doing well themselves, excuse me, or perhaps teaching apiaries. So what do we need to overcome? Well, I think a current mainstream thinking as well, we've just got to cut through some of this. And I'm afraid I think we've probably got to expose some of it and retrain some of the people that, or offer to retrain some of the people that are coming out with it. But if you look at it from an ordinary beekeeper's point of view, why believe something different from what you've already been told? And they assume that the person that told them first is an expert. May not be the case. But from their point of view, if that's all you've been told, that's all you know. So we've got to get the alternative out there. It's absolutely understandable, and there's no point calling somebody an idiot because they don't agree with you. You can even have idiots that do agree with you as well. But we've also got to get the message across that one size definitely doesn't fit all. So what perhaps suits a beekeeper, perhaps in Jersey, isn't going to suit one that's in Northumberland or perhaps the hills of Wales. I think we've somehow got to break this down and do things more regionally. And as BIBA and the National Bee Improvement Programme, I think that's what we've got to do to get the message across. So, what have I got here? Yeah, so I suggest then working with beekeeping associations and anybody else that wants to join in. I'll say beekeeping associations because they're easy. Most of the others, well, some of them have said they don't want to get involved with the bee improvement program. That's absolutely fine. I haven't got a problem. Got to state the case, give justifications, which I've mentioned. I think we've got to provide good sound information and material as well. You've got to back up the words with something behind it. The simple stuff like making the papers that Norman mentioned, just making them more readily available. We can also provide tuition and support, and that's coming down to local beekeeping association. But I think we need to do it from experience and knowledge, not somebody just picking up an idea and say, oh yeah, it sort of sounds a good idea, because quite honestly, that's why we got Buckfast at the moment, because it sounds a good idea. Buckfast also fashionable as well. They'll probably go out of fashion and something else will come in. And then of course, there's always the danger that if you want to try something different, there's always somebody likely to come in just to try to make a name for themselves. So beekeeping associations, then what can they do? Well, teach and encourage all their members, teachers, demonstrations, apiary managers. Keep good bees in the teaching apiary too. They can then produce bees and queens and improve the bee quality for everyone, not just locally, but for their members and the bees in the area. And face-to-face at shows, we go out and do talks, have a chat to them, talk about local bees rather than, oh yeah, this is an Italian bee, this is a whatever. You know, I think we've got to try and get them out of our repertoire. Some of the websites I see, Beekeeping Association websites, some of the stuff on there is a bit sort of fluffy, isn't it? It's there are 50,000 bees in a hive, a queen lays 3,000 eggs a day, that sort of stuff, rather than giving information about bees which are actually going to do well in the locality. Make sure that written material or good written material is available. I've seen a few Beekeeping Association libraries with some awful books in. about 10 years ago, we decided at Whisper Green that we go through and the poor books, we didn't take them down the local jumble sale or whatever. We just binned them. Certainly beginners like to get hold of library books. Make sure they're good sound stuff. Beginners and introductory events as well. Make sure that there are good sound beekeepers giving the presentations, and they give good sound information. The people that are starting beekeeping, we encourage them not to buy bees and kit until they're ready. And I think that's worked very well. Yes, we do get the occasional ones that want to charge off a must have. And they're the ones that very often don't last very long. They're the ones that all of a sudden say they're allergic when they're probably not allergic, they just don't like being stung. Try and produce bees and queens from local sources, either let's say certified members or known members who are going to produce decent bees, or do it from your own teaching apiary. It's quite simple. We've done it. And of course, warn about the dangers of imports, because I don't think there are too many people that can argue about some of the dangers. And in fact, it's rather difficult arguing against scientists. So for beekeepers then, assess colonies. I think you should be doing that anyway, and you probably are, but you may not be writing it down. We've got to get the message across that bees are food-producing animals. And if let's say a farmer or smallholder had chickens that don't lay, they're not chickens for very long. They are not pets. They are food-producing animals, and if they're not tough enough to live in the wild, they really shouldn't be here. They need to be survivors. There is no need to replace queens wholesale unless you've got very prolific ones, in which case I'd say, yes, do so. But if you replace the least suitable, and that's all you do, you're going to get somewhere. And if they aren't suitable, they probably won't even survive the winter anyway. So what is going to happen is that if we don't buy queens, we just raise queens from what we've got, we're going to end up with some decent bees. So the stronger and best suited will survive. So teaching at the apiary, in my view, practical tuition is incredibly valuable. It's surprising how quickly a good, responsive beekeeper can be with 2, 3, 4 visits. Some of them are incredibly good, but they're not going to get any better if everything is classroom based. Try and teach all levels of beekeeping if you can, not just for beginners, because people do need to move on from them. And I would say from the second year up to the 5th year is absolutely critical. Please don't abandon them, because if you're only teaching beginners, that's all you're going to have to do your future teaching. And it's not just your beekeeping association, it's beekeeping nationwide. Let them handle full colonies on their own, not like the ones I mentioned earlier. People aren't going to get any better if they don't do it. And with a teaching apiary, of course, you can produce queens, you can produce bees, you can produce honey. And don't say you can't, because we have year on year. And you ought to be able to produce some jolly good beekeepers as well. Here's our teaching apiary at Whisper Green, or rather the older one. You'll see where the trees are at the bottom end. Incidentally, all of those are on single brood. Some of them got 5 supers on. I know that looks as if there's a double brood down there, but that's actually a super, that's a brood chamber that's been used as a super. So this is the teaching apiary. And there's the queen mating area down at the bottom. Now, we've got plenty of space, but it could be on a different site. and I'll go through this in one of the other webinars we're going to do after the new year. You only need a mating apiary for what, 12, 14 weeks, something like that. So it could be temporary. Needn't cost very much at all. There's not that much cost there. And with this lot here, this is our new apiary. In 2020, okay, we had lockdown, so I managed to get a lot of things done, which is not always easy to do. There were 12 nukes that came out of last winter. They all overwintered, the whole lot. During the summer, I got up to 32. I'm now back down to 28 for the winter, uniting and people having queens and that sort of thing. Some of those nukes had 5 mated queens go through them this year. Most of only 3, perhaps 4, but some of them, the early ones, they had 5. So it's very, very productive. Not only that, some of those nukes were providing bees and brood for other nukes. Here's an open invitation to you. When the coronavirus allows, come and visit With for Green teaching apiary. It's in West Sussex, I know. We've only got near native bees. They really are just local jobbies. We've got 24 colonies there. They're kept on single brew box summer and winter, and we've got anywhere between 10 to 30 nukes they're used for queen mating. So the next webinar, bees and queens for everyone. I'll be discussing what we're doing. So it's assessing colonies, selecting, propagating, some methods for small and large scale queen rearing, nuke making, that sort of thing, queen mating and overwintering nukes. That's it, folks. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening. And can the dogs answer the question?
I don't know where to start on this one. We've had over 30 questions. I've been frantically trying to answer some of them.
They're all from the same person, I expect.
Yeah, me. No, I'll try to sum some of that. There's some cracking ones in here that we may take over to the
Hang on,
discussion.
How do you know they're cracking?
Because you wouldn't be able to answer them.
Oh, right, okay.
Right. Queen excluders. Do you use queen excluders?
Yes.
And you mentioned about small queens. How do you stop them getting through a queen excluder?
Right. I used to have problems with queens getting through queen excluders, but that was in the days when we had the old zinc long slot excluders. And I can't show you here, but what you end up with is one piece going up like that and the other piece next to it going down, and the queen got through sideways. I don't think I've genuinely had a queen go through a queen excluder probably for 5 years, I would think, at home or the teaching apiary. I think the answer is it's the thorax, it's the widest part. And it's that the queen excluder stops, whereas it's not the abdomen. The abdomen is reasonably flexible. I wouldn't try to do it because you'll soon damage a queen. It's surprising how quick you can damage a queen. Was there one question there or two?
Well, do you use queen excluders, and with small queens, do they get through?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So there are two questions. Yeah. Let's take the second one first then. No, don't have a problem. It's the thorax, which, if you think about it, is solid muscle. And try and hold a queen, and she's actually quite tough. It's basically, in sort of layman's terms, or my terms rather, it's basically a round ball of muscle with a hole in it, but it's got to be strong because it's powering 4 wings and 6 legs. And you know, you struggle to even to compress it. Yes, I always use queen excluders. I know there are people who don't, and sadly, I know there are people who are teaching beginners. I think you've got to be quite a good beekeeper and understand what's happening in the colony in order to use, not use queen excluders. I think for a beginner to do it, there's all sorts of things that come into it, such as if you get brood in your super combs, that leaves it wide open for greater wax moth. Just a simple thing like that, I think, is going to affect a beginner.
Okay, thank you. A couple of people have asked, you talk about keeping your bees in a simple brew box. Some of the slides you were showing, people are curious whether they were commercials or 14 by 12s. Do you just keep them on nationals or?
Mine are all nationals bar one. I've got one commercial at home for the simple reason, actually I find it's a nuisance. But the reason is that when I use mini nukes, when I use apideas, which are one of the mini nukes, I try to get the frames built out in a standard colony, and if possible with brooding as well, because then it holds the first one of the year, and they're not just going in blind. Now, what you find is you can only get 2 in a comb, a British standard comb, but you can get 6 in a commercial comb, frame. Sorry. So that's why the only reason I use a commercial, but quite frankly, I'd rather be without it. I'm quite happy to have commercials, but I think with relatively small numbers, which I've got, you really need just one type of hive. Also, my commercial is bottom bee space, and my own bees I run as top bee space. So then, of course, that messes the supers up, all sorts of things like that. You either get twice a gap or none.
Okay. In your experience, 57 years, do defensive bees produce more honey than calm bees?
No, this has been coming up for years and years and years. No, I don't think they do. You can get docile bees that produce good crops, and you can get bad tempered bees that produce good crops and poor crops as well. I really don't believe that one, and I might have done early on in my beekeeping, but not for an awful long time.
Fair enough.
Kurt, can I talk about calmness? Anybody who watched the National Honey Show webinars last week, if I think both Mike Palmer and Jeff Pettis suggested that we're not doing bees any good by selecting for docility, and to get these really soft bees. They both reckoned that they were losing quite a lot in other ways.
Fair enough. Here's one which is probably a whole webinar on its own right. Why do queens have shorter lives these days?
Oh, yeah. Go on to Dave Cushman's website and have a look for queen problems, and you'll see what I've written, what I've found out over the last 20 years. I don't know. Even the scientists don't know. They're coming up with various theories. If you want my honest opinion, have they asked for my honest opinion? Or I'll give it anyway.
Maybe, yeah.
I'll give it anyway. I tried to analyze this, and I reckon that a lot of things that are happening are driven by pheromones. And I'm wondering if pheromone being a chemical, I'm just wondering if some of the chemicals that are being thrown around the world at the moment aren't reacting with the pheromones and giving the bees a different message than they should have. And I'll tell you why, because I've seen both emergency cells and swarm cells in the same colony when the queen's been there. Things like that. And you think to yourself, well, hang on, this just should not happen. But there's lots of things like that happening. And it's just a thought I had. I've mentioned it to a few scientists and they go, that sounds interesting. And I think, well, sooner or later there's going to be a paper out on this, but it never arrives. But it's so easy to come up with, oh, it's got to be chemicals, it's got to be this, it's got to be that, got to be something else. My own stab is that there's actually several things that are causing the problems, not one. And what worries me is that perhaps if the scientists do come up with a solution for one, they'll rub their hands and say, right, got that one solved, onto something else, and we still got the same problems.
Okay. There's more questions coming. They're coming faster than you're answering them, actually. Can you please stop asking more questions? Roger's got a birthday evening to have with his dogs, no doubt, and he's got his best braces on. I've taken photographs of these questions so that we can get a fair few of them answered offline in Bibber Monthly articles or in the panel discussion that's coming up on the 17th of November.
Okay.
In the meantime, thank you so much, Roger, for another fascinating talk. And thank you to everyone for asking the questions. We did actually have exactly the number of attendees that was your age, coincidentally.
Cool.
380.
380, dear oh dear.
I think we've got as many questions coming as well. They're not stopping. Oh, no, thank you, Roger. Happy birthday. Thank you. Lots to consider.
Okay, and I'll see most of you next week.
Stop sending those complimentary ones, please.
Yeah, okay. Good night, Carl. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.